Chapter 5 of On the Klondike Trail. On the Trail. Woolly Wolf stood in deep snow at the summit of Chilkoot Pass. Scattered around him were tons of supplies, the outfits of hundreds of stampeders, all of which were covered with canvas to keep out the snow. The piles were marked with long sticks tied with pieces of cloth. "We use flags so that we can find our outfits after snowstorms," Mike Price explained. "Storms always seem to blow through the pass." Mike led the way to a pile marked by a green flag that flapped in the wind. He pulled a shovel from the pile and dug away 2 feet of snow. He emptied his backpack and added the new supplies to the pile. Willie and Jack did the same. "I think you will like the trip down," Mike said. "It's a lot faster than the way up. But first, there's something I want you to see." Mike led the way to where a crowd of men stood around a great pile of supplies. "It's a kind of tram," Mike explained. "They just built it. You see, the rope goes around a big wheel and down another wheel near the scales. A horse turns the wheel and the rope carries things up. So now you can pay that to have your outfit carried up by this tram. But I think it costs too much. They plan to build a bigger tram all the way from Canyon City to here." The snow had stopped falling, but Chilkoot Pass was windy and cold. Near the top of the golden stairs, Willie noticed a group of stampeders preparing to go back down the mountain. They were going to slide down in the snow. Soon, Willie watched Mike wave and disappear down the mountain. Then Jack waved and slid after him. Willie sat down in the snow and slid after Jack. Their excited shouts echoed off the mountains. During the next 2 weeks, Willie and Jack helped Mike carry the rest of its outfit to Chilkoot Pass whenever Mrs. Stewart and the winter weather allowed it. On New Year's Day 1898, Mike entered Canada. By the middle of January, Willie had earned enough money to buy his own outfit. Then he and Jack began to carry Willie's things to the summit whenever they could. On the sunny day in February, Jack stayed in Sheep Camp while Lucy hiked to the pass with Willie. The mountains that rose along Chilkoot Trail looked especially wild and beautiful in the brilliant sunshine that morning. Willie's outfit was almost all at the summit, and he would soon be ready to enter Canada. He was eager to join the stampede for gold. He wanted to find his father and uncle, but Willie also knew that he would miss the Stewarts. At the summit of Chilkoot Pass, Willie noticed some Mounties who were building a small wooden house for a checkpoint. He and Lucy talked with the Mounties, who gave them some hot tea to drink. The ride down from the summit was the best ever for Willie. He and Lucy were both excited when they reached the scales. With his heart beating fast, Willie put his arm around Lucy and gave her her first kiss. 2 weeks later, Willie, Lucy and Jack stood outside the Mountie station on Chilkoot Pass. Willie's outfit had been checked. At least he was ready to enter Canada. Snow was falling and a cold wind blew through the pass, but the 3 friends did not hurry. They talked for a while. Finally, Willie and Jack shook hands. "Thanks for your help, Willie. You're a good friend, Jack." Willie gave Lucy a hug. "I'll see you in Seattle," he said. "Remember what I told you." "Hey, what does that mean?" Jack asked his sister. Lucy did not answer. She just smiled and waved at Willie. "Be careful," she said. "I will," said Willie. "You too." Willie watched Jack and Lucy disappear down the mountain. Then he lifted the heavy backpack and turned toward the Klondike. Beyond Chilkoot Pass, the trail quickly dropped down to the edge of a frozen lake. Then it went slowly downhill past 2 more lakes before it reached Lindeman Lake, 8 miles from the pass. The trail from the pass was rocky and frozen, but around Lindeman Lake there was a forest. And near the end of the lake was the town of Lindeman. It was crowded with 2,000 stampeders. There were sawmills and wooden buildings and hundreds of tents in the town. Beyond Lindeman, the winter trail crossed the frozen lake. Willie was tired, cold and hungry when he reached Lindeman. He went into a restaurant and ordered a dinner of bacon, beans and bread. It was dark outside when he had finished eating. Oil lamps in the tents and buildings gave a weak light to the street. Willie found a small place to set up his tent on the edge of frozen Lindeman Lake. He was still in his clothes when he got into his sleeping bag, and he soon fell into an uneasy sleep. When he woke in the morning, Willie was cold. He ate a quick breakfast. Then he found a man with horses and hired him to take him to Chilcoot Pass and return with the rest of his things. With his outfit in Lindemann, Willie began to explore the town. He talked with the Mounties and their stations and began to look for his father and uncle. A week later, he was feeling depressed. He had supplies, but his money would soon be gone. Where were his father and uncle? How could he find them? One afternoon, as Willie walked toward a sawmill on the edge of the lake, he heard a sudden shout. Men began to run towards the sawmill. "Help!" he heard a voice call again. "My partner's under the logs!" Behind the sawmill, Willie saw a man with blood on his face. There were logs on top of his legs. Other men were lifting the logs, and Willie began to help. The men moaned in pain as they worked. After 15 minutes, the man was free. A doctor came and he told 4 men to carry the injured man to his surgery. All afternoon, Willie thought about what he had seen. That evening, he went back to the sawmill. A group of men was working to pile up the logs. Willie asked about the injured man. "The doctor said he will live," a man with red hair told Willie. "But they had to amputate one of his legs. I guess the stampede is over for Bill. Maybe for me too. He was my partner." Willie helped the other man pile the logs and they went back to his tent. 2 days later, Willie went to the post office to mail a letter to his mother. As he stepped out of the building, someone called his name. He turned. Mike Price was grinning and walking toward him. "Willie, you made it," Mike said. He shook Willie's hand with great energy. "When did you get to Lindemann?" The friends went into a restaurant. They ordered apple pie and coffee and they talked. Mike said he was moving his outfit to Bennett Lake. He planned to build a boat there. "Bennett is a little closer to gold, and every mile is important," Mike said. "When the ice melts, there's going to be a wild race down the Yukon River. It'll be like no other race in history." Willie told Mike about his search for his father and uncle, and suddenly Mike stopped him. "Do you still have your knife, Willie?" he asked. "May I see it?" Willie took out his knife and put it on the table. "Do you mean this?" he asked. Mike put a knife on the table too. It looked exactly like Willie's. "I got this knife in Bennett," Mike said. "A customer left it in the store by accident. I was shopping in the store and I found it. I ran after him, but he had disappeared." "Do you think it was Uncle Al?" Willie asked. "What did he look like?" "Mike, do you think he's still in Bennett?" 2 days later, Willie and Mike walked in front of a train of horses that carried their supplies to Bennett Lake. The sky was clear. The snowy mountains around them were brilliant in the sunshine. The town of Bennett on the edge of the lake looked much like Lindemann. Willie saw 30 or 40 new wooden buildings and hundreds of canvas tents. He saw several sawmills. The mountain police had a station in Bennett, and everywhere Willie looked, all around town, in camps around the lake, stampeders were building boats of all sizes and designs. Mike and Willie unloaded their outfits at Mike's camp. Then they went to the store where Mike had found the German knife. Willie spoke to the store's owner. He described his father and uncle, but with such a busy store, the owner could not remember whether he had seen them or not. "Why don't you get a job in the store?" Mike said. "You can watch for them while you are working." Willie asked the store owner if he needed another worker. At first, the owner was not interested. Willie then offered to work for a little pay, and finally the owner agreed. Willie started to work at the store the next day. He sold rope and tools, shovels, axes, and saws to crowds of customers. It was tiring work. Many stampeders were not pleasant customers, and Willie's legs hurt as he had to stand all day. One afternoon, Willie went into the storeroom to get a box of work clothes that had just arrived. He opened the box and found sturdy clothes just like those that he was wearing. He looked at the label inside the shirt. Wolfwear, Seattle, USA. Willie smiled. The clothes were from his mother's business. After more than 2 weeks in Bennett, Willie had not seen even one stampeder that he knew, except for Mike. Then, one morning, he came in from the storeroom with a box of nails. He put the box on the floor and cut it open with his knife. Suddenly he heard a voice that he knew. Willie stood and looked at the man who had spoken. He was talking to the store owner. "I need a knife," the man said. "It is for my brother. He had a very good one, but he lost it. Do you have any German knives?" Willie stared at the man. For a moment he did not move. Then he picked up his knife. He quickly walked across the floor. "Do you mean like this?" he asked. He held out the knife in front of the man. "Why, yes," the man said, "exactly like that." His voice stopped. Karl Wolf turned and saw his son. Willie had a giant grin on his face. "Hello, father," Willie said. "Willie, what are you doing here?" his father shouted. "How did you get here?" "The same way you and Uncle Al did," Willie answered. "I came on the Chilcoot Trail." Chapter 6 of On the Klondike Trail by Richard P. Emanuel. Hannah. Spring came slowly to the Yukon River in May of 1898. The days grew longer, the birds began to sing again, and flowers started to appear again, but the lakes and streams that poured their water into the Yukon River were still covered with ice. In a small camp on Bennett Lake, Albert Wolff walked up and down along the frozen shore. Karl Wolff and Mike Price sat next to a fire on the beach. Near them, a small boat full of supplies sat on logs. It was named Hannah, and it was ready to be pushed into the water as soon as the ice melted. "Al, come and have some coffee," Karl Wolff called to his younger brother. "The ice won't melt any faster just because you're watching it." The three men were still drinking coffee when Willie Wolff arrived. "I've just visited the Mounties," he said. "Colonel Steele said that the ice is very thin now. He thinks it will break in a few more days." Albert took out his pipe and filled it with tobacco. "I'll tell you the truth, Willie," he said. "Either the ice will break soon or your Uncle Al will. I just hope the ice breaks first." Albert puffed on his pipe while the others laughed. 2 days later, on May 29th, the ice on Lindeman and Bennett Lakes began to break apart. Water flowed through the lakes and poured into the Yukon River, carrying the broken ice along with it. More than 7,000 boats of every possible design followed the ice down the river. Thousands of stampeders and millions of pounds of supplies were crowded onto the boats. The long winter had held the stampeders back. Now they flowed towards the goldfields in a fantastic spring flood. The great boat race to the Klondike had begun, and Hannah was in the race. Willie and the others aboard Hannah were excited that they were moving towards the gold again, but the trip was still hard work. They all took turns at the jobs on the boat. One man watched from the front of the boat while one worked the rudder and two pulled the oars. When the wind was strong, they put up a sail for some extra help. They slept very little. The man in front of the boat watched carefully for rocks and for other boats. Some of the stampeders around them traveled in small canoes, and these were often hard to see. Others traveled on large boats loaded with dogs, horses and cargo, and these slow boats sometimes got in the way. On the third afternoon, Willie was sitting in the back of the boat. The tops of the mountains along the river were covered with snow, which glowed in the sunshine. Suddenly, Karl Wolff shouted, "Rock ahead, Willie! Left! Go left!" Willie jumped up and pushed hard on the rudder. Hannah turned quickly. A moment later, the boat passed a large dark rock. "That was close," said Mike Price as he pulled on an oar. "Well done, Willie." Willie and the others had already seen many boats get damaged or destroyed on the river. Some had crashed into other boats, others had crashed into rocks and broken apart. The journey was most dangerous in the canyons where the river was narrow and fast and rocky, and where so many boats were trying to get through in a hurry. A few days later, the evening sky was dark when Hannah reached a crowd of boats waiting at the entrance to a long canyon. A group of Mounties stopped all boats on the river to check them before they entered the canyon. "It's dangerous for the next 5 miles, a young Mountie told the stampeders. "More than 100 boats have already been destroyed here, and 5 men have been killed. Women and children must walk around the canyon. There is a trail over here." "How old are you, son?" he asked Willie. The Mountie checked Hannah and asked questions about the man's experiences with boats and rivers. Then he said Hannah could go, but not Willie. He was too young. He would have to walk. Willie began to argue, but his father stopped him. "I'm sorry, Willie, but the Mountie is right," Karl said. "We'll see you on the other side." Willie said nothing. He pushed some things into a backpack and walked away. Then he felt angry and disappointed. He followed a trail that climbed to the top of the dark gray rock on the side of the canyon. When he looked down into the canyon a few minutes later, his feelings turned from anger into worry. In the canyon below, Willie saw a man in a canoe going very fast around rocks until he disappeared around a bend in the river. Following the canoe was a large boat with 5 men. It hit the rock and began to spin. It started to turn over, and by the time it had disappeared around the turn, the boat was upside down in the river. Willie looked back and saw Hannah in a long line of boats. It would be 2 or 3 hours before it would be Hannah's turn to go into the canyon. Willie decided to wait and watch for his boat at the end of the canyon. When he reached the end of the canyon, what Willie saw made him worry even more. Beyond the canyon, on both sides of the river, he saw boats that had been pulled out of the water. Many had been badly damaged. Some had been broken into pieces. Wood and wet supplies were spilled everywhere. Willie sat down to watch the boats as they came out of the canyon. Some floated out carrying men who were shouting with excitement. Many of these kept going down the river without stopping. Others stopped to pick up women and children before they pushed into the river again. Other boats floated out broken or even upside down. Sometimes stampeders were swimming next to their damaged boats. After a long wait, Willie saw a boat that he had seen near Hannah. He stood up. Next came a canoe which moved around the last big rock and floated down the river. Then came a big boat. It was spinning when it appeared. It crashed into the final rock and got stuck. Then 3 men in the boat were thrown into the water and swam away. A minute later, Hannah appeared. Willie saw that their boat had come through the canyon without any damage. Willie's father stood at the rudder, while Albert and Mike pulled the oars and tried to look ahead. They shouted to each other about whatever they saw. Albert was the first to see danger ahead. Willie could see him shout. Soon all 3 of them shouted and Hannah quickly turned to the right, but it was too late. Hannah's side crashed into the front of the boat that was stuck on the rock, and suddenly both boats were spinning down the river. The first boat quickly broke into 2 pieces and sank. Then Hannah's front hit the wreck and the boat turned upside down. Willie ran down the trail to the river. He saw the stampeders help pull his father and Mike to the shore, but Uncle Al was further down the river. He was holding onto the upside down boat and trying to push it toward the shore. Willie ran and jumped into the river. He swam to his uncle's side. Together they kicked and pushed and pulled the damaged boat to the shore. We still have most of the food, Mike said an hour later. A lot of the camping equipment and most of the tools are gone. And we are all alive, Carl said quietly. No one is badly hurt. Perhaps we can borrow some tools and fix Hannah well enough to go down the river. The Mountie said there is nothing as bad as this canyon the rest of the way to Dawson. We either go on to Dawson or we go back to Skagway. Mike said, What do you say, Willie? Which way should we go? The boy said nothing but pointed down the river toward Dawson. Albert grinned and hit Willie's shoulder. That's my nephew, he shouted. All right, Carl said. We go on then. Chapter 7 of On a Klondike Trail by Richard P. Emanuel. Willie's Goal. 5 months later, on a sunny afternoon in October, the Wolf House in Seattle was filled with conversation. In the living room, Carl and Albert Wolf and Mike Price drank beer while they answered Jack Stewart's questions about the boat race to the Klondike. They told him stories about the famous gold fields, and Jack told them about Sheep Camp and the Gold Nugget restaurant. In the kitchen, Mary Stewart and her sister helped Hannah Wolf and her daughters take pies out of the oven. Then they put in ham, potatoes and chicken. Willie and Lucy tried to help, but the kitchen was too crowded. Willie's mother soon sent them outside. In the autumn garden, Willie took Lucy's hand and led her to his favorite tree. They sat beneath the tree and talked about all that had happened to them since they had said goodbye on Chilkoot Pass. Our business did quite well after you left Sheep Camp, Willie, Lucy began. The restaurant was very busy all spring, but there were not as many customers by the end of the summer. Did you know that they are building a railroad from Skagway to Bennett Lake? Mother says that after the railroad opens, there will be no more stampeders on the Chilkoot Trail. We decided to sell the Gold Nugget restaurant in September. We came back to Seattle with more than $20,000. Lucy, that's wonderful, Willie said. You did better than we did in the Klondike. We were just too late. When we got to Dawson, we found that the best places to mine gold had already been taken. Most of the best places were taken before we had even left Seattle. Oh, some of the late stampeders got lucky. But most of us earned money by working in the other people's mines. I made almost $1,200 working in gold mines during the summer. Then I spent some of it on the trip home. Lucy and Willie talked for the rest of the afternoon. At 6 o'clock, Hannah called them inside for dinner. The dining room of the Wolf House seemed to Willie almost as crowded and noisy as the Gold Nugget restaurant. When the food had been set on the table, Hannah Wolf stood and asked everyone to be quiet. This celebration is to welcome everyone back, our new friends and especially our family members, from all their adventures, Hannah said. We are happy that you are all with us today and that you are all safe in Seattle. As the dinner continued, the conversation and jokes grew louder and louder. Carl told the story of Tom Lippy, a young man from Seattle who brought home a suitcase with 200 pounds of gold from the Klondike. It is true that Tom Lippy got very rich, said Hannah with a smile. So did some of the others who reached the gold fields early, but some of us who stayed home made money from the stampeders. Running away to dig up the ground somewhere is not the only way to make money. Why, you could also run a restaurant like we did, said Jack. Even stampeders have to eat. And they need clothes, said Carl. Hannah, you're right. And I'm very glad that you and the girls were smart enough to stay home and make and sell clothes to all of us crazy stampeders. Wolfwear has grown. You have built a very good business. I'm proud of you. Yes, but the adventure, Albert shouted. No one can say how much the adventure was worth. I just got a letter from a friend of mine in Dawson. He is going to Nome, Alaska to look for gold, and I might join him. Who will go with me? Mike? Jack? How about you, Willie? There's plenty of gold in Alaska, I tell you, and this time we'll find gold. Everyone at the table laughed, long and loud. After a moment, Albert laughed too. No thanks, Uncle Al, Willie said. We did have a great adventure, but I don't need to get to Nome. I found my gold on the Chilco Trail. He took Lucy's hand. I found all the gold I need. Ja, das war die Geschichte von Willie Wolf und seiner Familie, erzählt von Richard P. Emanuel im Englischen, wie gesagt. Und ich hoffe, es hat euch gefallen. Wenn ja, würde ich mich sehr über einen Daumen hoch freuen. Wenn ihr findet, dass ich solche Lesungen öfter machen sollte, dann lasst mir doch bitte einen Kommentar unter dem Video und sagt mir vielleicht auch, welche Bücher ich euch vorlesen soll, welche Geschichten, Kurzgeschichten vielleicht auch ich euch vorlesen soll. Gerne auch im Deutschen, muss nicht zwingend Englisch sein. Das Buch hier ist jetzt natürlich die englische Ausgabe gewesen, aber das heißt ja nicht zwingend, dass es immer so sein muss. Ja, in diesem Sinne bedanke ich mich fürs Zusehen, fürs Zuhören und sage bis zum nächsten Mal and so long.